Welcome back to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. But although there were problems nationwide, there are really 6 critical states. Pennsylvania, where Biden leads by 82,000 votes. Michigan, where Biden leads by 155,000. Wisconsin, where Biden leads by 20,000. Arizona, where Biden leads by 10,000. Georgia, where Biden leads by 14,000. And Nevada, where Biden leads by 33,000. So this is not an easy task for Donald Trump. There's a lot of votes that he needs to overcome or invalidate. And I'll be very surprised if he's able to accomplish that. But he absolutely has the right to try. And the so-called news media is absolutely wrong to report this election as final. So what are some specific allegations being made in those 6 states? In Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, which is Pittsburgh, officials counted nearly 2,500 ballots that didn't have the legally required declaration dates on them. I'm not talking about postmarks. These were ballot submission forms that voters failed to properly complete. And under Pennsylvania law, that means the votes don't count. But officials in Allegheny County, and maybe others, I don't know, simply ignored state law and counted the ballots. An attorney for Allegheny County, a guy by the name of Andy Zeffie, said, and this is a direct quote, "What we have here is essentially a technicality that we don't want voters to get disenfranchised with," end quote. No, counselor. The Pennsylvania requirement that ballots be cast in the manner described by law is not a technicality. It's the law. And it is the law that the people's duly elected legislature passed and the duly elected governor signed. You don't get to decide which laws you follow and which laws you don't. And neither did election officials who knowingly and willingly violated Pennsylvania's law by allowing illegal ballots to be cast under the guise of not wanting to disenfranchise people. If those people didn't follow Pennsylvania's election laws, they disenfranchised themselves. And of course, Pennsylvania also has the issue of ballots being properly completed by the voter, but not being received by the deadline established by state law. Now, if you remember, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court said that was okay, even though their ruling was in direct contravention of Pennsylvania law. And the U.S. Supreme Court foolishly refused to overturn that blatantly unconstitutional action. But the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling was a 4-4 tie because the court was ruthless. Amy Coney Barrett hadn't been confirmed yet. Now, if Ruth Bader Ginsburg was part of that ruling, it would have certainly been a 5-4 count. But the result would have been the same, that being that the Pennsylvania Supreme Court's unconstitutional ruling stands. That count was supposed to have been segregated based upon Justice Alito's order, but there's some question as to whether or not that happened with all the late ballots. If it didn't, it will be impossible to deduct them from the count because they were commingled with legally cast ballots. And that's why it would have been better for the high court to uphold the rule of law from the beginning, because the remedy then would have been vote before the deadline. Now the remedy would have to be invalidating votes or tossing the entire election results and letting the state legislature choose Pennsylvania's 20 electors. And because that would be so serious, it's far less likely to happen than it would have been to simply enforce the law in the first place. A postal worker in Erie, Pennsylvania, named Richard Hopkins, says he and other postal employees were told by their supervisors to backdate the postmarks on vote-by-mail ballots, something that would be not only election fraud, but a violation of postal laws as well. That's pretty serious, right? Well, I took it seriously until I read in the Washington Post that he recanted his claims in a sworn affidavit. My mistake there was accepting what the liars and the fake news were saying, because as it turns out, Richard Hopkins did not recant his allegations. But by all accounts, the Postal Service is not even investigating to see if his claims have merit. Instead, they're trashing him in the media as being a terrible mailman with a poor work record and an axe to grind. No, I don't know the guy, but I certainly want his allegations to be investigated. And I want other postal workers to make statements to investigators under oath. And if nothing's there, nothing's there. But it needs to be investigated. Lindsey Graham claims that 25,000 requests for absentee ballots from Pennsylvania nursing homes were received on the same day. Were they? I don't know. He made the claim, but he didn't offer any evidence to support it. If true, obviously that would be a problem. But if claims like that are going to be made, they need to be backed up. And they need to be backed up at the time of the claim, because if they're not, then the narrative put out by the so-called fact checkers is that it didn't really happen. And once that happens, it's hard to convince people otherwise, even with evidence. And by the way, even if those 25,000 ballots were all individually cast by eligible voters, if they were collected by ballot harvesters, that would be illegal in Pennsylvania. So even an innocent explanation of those 25,000 arriving on the same day may not be so innocent. In Detroit, Michigan, election officials covered the windows to block the view of their tabulation process. Why? What did they have to hide? There's a lawsuit in Michigan based on a sworn affidavit by Melissa Caroni, who was working at the vote counting facility as an IT contractor with Dominion Voting Services in Detroit. She alleges serious process malfeasance by election workers. She says ballots were counted multiple times, ballots were altered by workers, and Republican observers were not granted access. And when they objected, their objections were ignored. There's another lawsuit that has been filed by the Trump campaign in Michigan that is supported by a sworn affidavit from a city employee who claims she was told to process mailed ballots that had no signature or whose signature didn't match the one on file, and that she was told to ignore the required legal verifications and simply process every ballot she was given with no regard to whether or not that ballot met the legal requirements necessary to be processed. One more point about Michigan before I move on to another state. It is a fact that several absentee ballot poll books in Detroit are out of balance, meaning the number of absentee ballots received and processed does not match the number of votes that were cast by absentee ballot. Could there be an innocent explanation for that? Yes. Is there? I don't know. Election officials acknowledged the discrepancy, but they didn't explain it. So how many of Detroit's absentee ballot poll books didn't balance? I suppose it would help if you knew how many absentee ballot poll books Detroit had, huh? Detroit has 134 absentee ballot poll books. How many were out of balance? Take a guess. 94 of them didn't match. Yep. The numbers in 94 out of 134 absentee ballot poll books in Detroit didn't match up. It would be bad enough if it was 1. It was 94. That is 70% of them. But the fake news is telling you the election was perfect. Yeah, well, as usual, the fake news is lying to you. Now, because of those discrepancies in Detroit's absentee ballot poll books, 2 Republicans on the Wayne County Canvassing Board refused to certify the results. But within a few hours of being called racists, they both caved and the results were certified. Because, hey, if the race card gets played, that's an automatic win for Democrats, right? It couldn't possibly be that the Republicans on the board were concerned that the math clearly indicated errors in 70% of Detroit's vote-by-mail poll books, now could it? Yet that was the reason. And that was the reason they gave for refusing to certify the vote count. But as soon as they were called racists, the spineless Republicans caved, and the vote count was certified. Couldn't they articulate the real reason and let the false accusations of racism roll off their backs? No, of course not. They're Republicans. And Republicans are typically weak and spineless in the face of false accusations. And that's why so many false accusations are made against them, because it works. It's disgraceful. It's disgraceful that the Democrats make the false accusations, and it's disgraceful that the Republicans surrender to it. In Wisconsin, it's been alleged that poll workers illegally altered witness statements on thousands of ballots. Wisconsin Statute 6.86 says that if an absentee ballot isn't signed by a witness, who must also write their address, then the ballot is considered invalid and must be returned to the voter to have the witness statement corrected. Supposedly, election workers simply ignored that requirement and processed ballots without them, or in some cases signed as witnesses themselves, even though they obviously didn't witness the voter do anything. Now, the Trump campaign has already paid $3 million for recounts in Dane and Milwaukee counties. Milwaukee County is obviously Milwaukee. Dane County is Madison, the state's capital. Both counties are big and dominated by Democrats. What's unique about those two counties? Well, Rudy Giuliani claims that there are 100,000 absentee ballots in those two counties for which there is no record the ballots were ever requested by the voters. In other words, if what he said is accurate, someone other than the person whose name the vote was cast under actually cast the vote. And he also claims there were precincts with vote totals that far exceeded the number of registered voters, and that's after taking into consideration the people who registered to vote on Election Day itself. In Arizona, Maricopa County, which includes Phoenix, is the epicenter of claims the Trump campaign is making about fraud there. They allege that dead people voted, mail-in ballots were improperly accepted, and that poll workers at some precincts didn't follow proper procedures for in-person voting on Election Day. But in terms of the actual counting of the votes, Arizona law requires a mandatory hand count audit of 2% of the ballots cast on Election Day and of 1% of the ballots cast early. And that audit showed the machines accurately tallied the votes. Now, the Trump campaign wants a bigger percentage to be audited, but the letter of the law has been met with the percentage that has already been done. So of the 6 states in question, I think President Trump's chances in Arizona are the weakest. In Georgia, in Floyd County, just that one county, the manual audit showed that there were more than 2,600 ballots that hadn't been tallied at all. Of those ballots, 865 were for Biden and 1,643 were for Trump. That's a net gain for Trump of 778 votes. President Trump supposedly trailed Biden by 14,000 votes. So in Floyd County alone, Trump picked up 5.5% of what he needs to win. The explanation for the problem in Floyd County was that county election officials didn't upload votes from a memory card in one of their ballot scanning machines that was used for early voting. So more than 2,600 people voted early in Georgia, and their votes weren't counted at all until the hand audit was ordered. And that's what it was. It's an audit. It's not a recount. A recount can still be requested. Well, Georgia has 159 counties. Now, I'm not saying Trump's going to pick up 800 votes in each of the 159 counties, but I am going to ask, how the hell can you just forget to count votes? That was in Floyd County, Georgia. Well, guess what happened in Fayette County, Georgia? They found 2,755 votes that hadn't been included in the initial count. Yep. That now makes 2 of Georgia's 159 counties to just not include thousands of legal votes in the count they reported to the state. Fayette County didn't help Trump's numbers as much as Floyd County did. In Fayette County's previously omitted votes, Biden got 1,128 and Trump got 1,577. So it was a net gain for Trump of only 449 votes. But it was still a gain for Trump. And it was a gain that, if Democrats and the media had their way, would never have been discovered. They just wanted to accept at face value what they were told originally. They didn't want anything audited. They said Trump was a sore loser and a crybaby because he wanted the vote count to be confirmed. Well, in that confirmation process, which is far from finished, more than 5,000 legitimate votes were found. How's that for disenfranchising people, huh? Before I just said that, had you heard about either of those counties finding those uncounted votes? Probably not. But if you have, I'm certain you didn't hear about it from the big media. I know you didn't hear about it on ABC, NBC, CBS, MSNBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post, or any other national so-called news source. I read it in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. The big media has ignored it. They're still spoon-feeding you the lie that the election was the most secure election in American history and that Trump is just a sore loser. But with those 3,220 Trump votes from Floyd and Fayette counties, he has narrowed Biden's lead by 8.6%. Will he pick up the remaining 91.5% he needs to win? I don't know, probably not. But the point I'm making is not that Trump won Georgia or that he won nationally or even that he's going to win when all this is over. The point I'm making is that Trump's claims obviously have validity and that the fake news is deliberately trying to convince you otherwise. My point is that the fake news cannot be believed. My point is that the so-called journalists are liars. My point is that what the big media spoon feeds you under the guise of being news is actually propaganda. My point is that the activists in the newsroom are lying to you, and when it comes to Donald Trump, they lie to you more than usual. David Schaefer, who is the chairman of the Republican Party of Georgia, said that even the hand count the state is conducting can't be trusted. He claims that DeKalb County gave Joe Biden almost 10,000 phantom votes, 9,626 to be exact. He says one batch of the manual count gave 10,707 votes for Biden and 13 votes for Trump. But the actual count was, yes, just 13 for Trump, but only 1,081 for Biden, not 10,707. The manual hand count of that one batch of ballots gave 890% more votes to Joe Biden than he actually got. And that's just one batch where the error, which might be too generous of a word, was discovered by Republican observers. There's no way to know what's not being caught. Why is that? Because there's only one observer to monitor the counts at 10 counting tables. So there's no way to see everything that's going on. And I should point out, by the way, that 890% error in Biden's favor had been verified and signed off by not one, but by two official ballot counters. And lastly, the manual count being conducted in Georgia is simply a hand count of all the ballots that were previously counted by machines. Officials are not doing anything whatsoever to determine the validity of those ballots. If the ballots exist, they're being counted. Simple as that. So even this manual count will tell us nothing about fraud, although it could debunk the hammer and scorecard theory that the vote count was changed in the computer, in Georgia anyway. Interestingly, Lin Wood, one of Trump's attorneys, said on Tuesday that he had, quote, irrefutable evidence that Georgia local election officials were instructed by state to report original vote totals and not report recount totals, which are different. End quote. If that's even half true, those election officials need to go to prison. All I want, and all any decent American should want, is an accurate count of the legitimate vote. Whatever the accurate count of the legitimate vote is fine. That's our system, or at least it's supposed to be. And if my guy loses legitimately, so be it. But decent Americans should be asking why there is such resistance by Democrats to every effort to verify the legitimacy of the vote. Methinks thou dost protest too much. In Nevada, the Trump campaign claims widespread irregularities and process malfeasance. Things like dead people voting in multiple jurisdictions, and signatures on mail-in ballots not being authenticated. And supposedly they have sworn affidavits from election workers who claim to have either witnessed fraud or were told to commit fraud. Jesse Binnall, Trump's campaign lawyer who is handling lawsuits in Nevada, said, and this is a direct quote, We have identified thousands of instances of fraud and other irregularities that make it very clear that the results that we got out of Nevada, that the media has been so quick to report, are simply inaccurate. Inaccurate to the point that we now believe that Donald Trump won Nevada once you take out the fraud and irregularities. End quote. In Clark County, where Las Vegas is, it's by far the most populous county in Nevada. And did you hear what they did earlier this week? Of course you didn't, because the so-called news media doesn't want you to know. Clark County found a ton of discrepancies in their election process. Things like duplicate activations, check-in errors, canceled votes, and other problems. There were so many discrepancies that they have no idea whatsoever who won the race in Clark County. So they completely threw out the election results and will hold a special election next month. No, I'm not talking about the presidential election. They threw out the results of the election for Clark County Commissioner, District C. But if the vote count was so flawed that they don't know who won a county commission election, how can they be confident they know the vote count in the presidential election? They can't. And that's my point. It is an absolute, indisputable, easily verified and proven fact that Clark County, Nevada had such little confidence in the accuracy of their election that they threw out the results and will have a do-over. But the fake news keeps telling you there are no problems with America's elections and that Donald Trump is just an orange crybaby who's throwing a temper tantrum and is grasping at straws and making things up. Well, he's obviously not, now is he? But Nevada is not one of the states where the election being invalidated and thrown out by a court would do Trump any good, because Nevada's state legislature is majority Democrat, so if they were to choose the state's 6 electors to the Electoral College, they would choose ones for Biden anyway. Trump's only hope is to invalidate specific votes that can be proven are fraudulent. But those votes have been commingled with the legitimate votes, so there's no way to do that. So I think Nevada will be blue no matter what. Rudy Giuliani also claims to have proof of widespread vote fraud in New Mexico and Virginia. But even if that's true, and more importantly proven to be true, an invalidated election in New Mexico and Virginia will not help Donald Trump at all because the state legislatures of both those states have Democrat majorities. So if the legislatures end up choosing their state's electors, Biden would still get them. All right, this was a very, very long segment. I've got to take our break, and then we'll come back and wrap it up when the Mike Bates Show continues. Welcome back to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. Today's show is not about me trying to convince you that Donald Trump won the election. I'm waiting for the courts to rule on the evidence before I take a position on that. Today's show is about how the fake news has improperly told you that Joe Biden won the election, and that Donald Trump has no basis for any of his complaints about fraud. Today's show was to share with you some of President Trump's claims the fake news is refusing to report, claims the fake news label is false if it manages to get out through other channels, claims the fake news is hiding. Have you heard about any of the examples I gave today? If you have, you've probably heard about them on talk radio. Because the so-called news media has moved on. Their narrative is that Biden won decisively and every claim to the contrary is just delusional Trump supporters. But these allegations are supported by affidavits sworn under penalty of perjury, which, if untrue, subject the attestee to criminal charges. Does that automatically mean it's all true? No. People commit perjury all the time. But with the massive number of sworn claims of fraud and process malfeasance, it is irresponsible of the press to ignore it. Because if it ends up being true, it will come as a shock to the violent mobs who think Biden is irreversibly going to be sworn in on January 20th. And while I acknowledge that is probably the likely outcome, it is not the foregone conclusion the irresponsible media is portraying it to be. Now, admittedly, Trump's lawyers have been big on allegations and small on evidence. Maybe the campaign's legal strategy is don't fire until you see the white in the judge's eyes. Maybe they don't want to reveal their hand to the media because that would give the fake news an opportunity to spin it prior to the judges seeing it and ruling on the actual merit of the evidence. And don't think judges aren't influenced by what the media says. They may not be as influenced as your typical uninformed man on the street, but they are influenced. But the only way Donald Trump can possibly win re-election is if he is able to convince the courts, and ultimately the Supreme Court of the United States, that the vote was so poorly conducted and that it was so rife with fraud that the only remedy is to toss it completely and let the state legislatures decide who their state's electors to the Electoral College will be. Do I want all these claims to be true? No. And yes. No, because I don't want it to be true that the Democrats and their deep state allies are so corrupt that they would literally commit high treason against the American people and against the American Constitution. And yes, because if it did happen, as Trump's lawyers allege, it needs to be exposed. And it needs to be exposed so convincingly that even the demon rats and their allies in the propaganda press will have to acknowledge it and hang their heads in shame. I voted for Donald Trump. I want him to prevail, but only if he actually won the lawful vote. Likewise, I don't want Joe Biden to win, but if he legitimately won, then so be it. He legitimately won. But the key words there were lawful and legitimate. And at this point, we don't know how lawful and how legitimate it was. But if Trump's people are going to allege that the vote was unlawful and illegitimate, they had better be specific about it. And they need to present evidence that will survive judicial scrutiny and be so irrefutable that even Joe Biden would have to admit that there was wrongdoing. I think it's a long shot that Donald Trump will continue with a second term. But he needs to be given the opportunity to try. And the media needs to quit lying about it. I'm Mike Bates. Thanks for listening.